Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. With the punishment for Red Bull's cost cap breach now officially being determined, teams around the paddock have given their suggestions on whether the punishment was too harsh, too lenient, or about right. McLaren and Ferrari say they wanted to see far more severe penalties, but Toto Wolff from Mercedes reckons it will be a significant damper on teams wanting to do this in the future, and saying a 10% reduction is pretty significant. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you are new as always. Wow, a lot to dive into today, so much drama. If you guys missed it, yesterday the penalty was confirmed for Red Bull breaching the cost cap in 2021, a $7 million fine. Just to note, that's not a $7 million reduction in the cost cap that they have going forwards. That would be a big deal. It's just a $7 million fine, which of course is peanuts really, and a 10% reduction in aerodynamic research time for next season. That really is the key issue here at play. Aston Martin, because they had a procedural breach, they filled in a form wrong or something, they got a fine for it. They didn't actually go over the cap though, as Red Bull did, and also it was kind of confirmed in the accepted breach agreement that they believe, the FIA, that Aston Martin did not effectively do this in bad faith, with dishonesty, or in a fraudulent manner. They actually said the same thing about Red Bull. Pretty interesting. They said that Red Bull, from their perspective, did not necessarily intend to go over it, but of course it's always going to raise questions when the only team that, won last year's drivers, won this year's constructors, is the only one of the 10 teams that went over the cap. And I think that if they thought that Red Bull did this deliberately, the penalty would probably be much more severe, at which point, you would imagine this, I think personally this will deter teams from going over it in the future, not just the penalty, but also, as Toto Wolff is going to say, the reputational impact here. But at the same time, if you do happen to go over and the penalty isn't massive, as some would argue it's not, then does it really prevent teams doing that in the future? But you would think that if Red Bull do this again, you'd imagine that for the second recurrence, their penalty should be higher, right? You would think, but who knows what the regulations say? They are very vague, right? Effectively, the FIA can do what they please. Now, of course, Horner had to go in front of the press and talk about this, and it's a difficult one for Horner, I'm sure, because he was talking all this about, they didn't breach it, it was absolutely fine, and he doesn't want to admit guilt because, look, this doesn't look good on Red Bull at the start, but he's also defending his company and the way they did things, and that they spent on catering as like a company benefit over the top. They didn't feel like that should be included, but the thing is, and he also went on to say that they didn't spend any extra money on the development of the car. The thing is, though, that everything is included, and this is kind of the spin that Horner's putting on it, in my opinion, is that just because they overspent on catering doesn't mean they spent too much on the car. But other teams also had to do sick pay. They also had to give some garden leave for certain employees. They also had to pay for their canteen, right? So if they had to spend X on the canteen, then their money for the car had to go down by a certain amount to compensate for that, to fit under the budget. Whereas Red Bull didn't make that adjustment, and therefore you could argue they have spent too much on the car. So it's all a matter of perspective and interpretation, which seems to be Horner's favourite word at the moment. But he does say, look, they accept the penalties begrudgingly, but we accept them, effectively saying that if they'd have kind of gone on with this, they could have appealed it and it would have taken another 12 months. But I think he basically said it's in the interest of the community to just take the penalty and move on. But more than likely, they were thinking, well, if we do kind of keep fighting this over the next 12 months in court, then, the penalty could get worse, theoretically, right? It's no guarantee that it would actually end up better for them regardless. So yes, effectively, they accepted it, and Horner doesn't want to say they admit they're guilty. They don't think they are, but still, obviously, the community has kind of made up its mind on that one already, and he's made some other statements on the exceedance and all this, and the percentage and everything like that, saying that it didn't affect the car, but nonetheless, if you breach the rules, there is going to be a punishment of some sort. And other team principals and others have said, well, look, if we are, for example, Hamilton, Brazil 2021, the rear wing is 0.5 millimeters or something larger than it should be, disqualified from qualifying. If you turn up to the race and have 0.99 litres of fuel after the race, not the 1 litre you need for the sample, you get disqualified. So it's a sport of fine margins, and that's why they have been punished. And I thought even an interesting statement here from Horner when he said he's astounded that other teams have not found themselves in this position. It's like, I don't know, no other teams managed to make it happen. So yeah, clearly they were pushing the envelope rather too far on this occasion. Now, Horner gave his thoughts on the kind of extent of the penalty, because he is incentivized to say the penalty is extreme, and others are incentivized to say the opposite. He says $7 million is an enormous amount of money, which, it's an enormous amount of money for Haas, let's say, but it's definitely not for Red Bull. And he describes the penalty as a draconian penalty, the 10% reduction, the ability to use our wind tunnel and aerodynamic tools. That represents between 0.25 and 0.5 seconds of lap time. times. This is his perspective on how much reduction or how much that actually affects the pace of their car. So it's an interesting one. My perspective is, and to my understanding, this penalty only comes in over the next 12 months. So a lot of the testing they've done for the start of next season isn't probably going to be that much different. I'd expect their car at the start of next year to pretty much be as good as it would have been without this reduction. But by the time they get to 6 months into next season and certainly into 2024, this reduction should have some impact, which of course is what the other teams are hoping for. And even, well, as he says the following, I'm sure for them the penalty won't be enough even if we burn our wind tunnel down, which is probably true. Of course, the other teams have incentives to push heavily for penalties, McLaren included. They have said that effectively they don't think this penalty is enough really to justify action against those that willfully break the rules. And that's why some people look at this and think that Red Bull have effectively deliberately gone over to gain an advantage. Horner denies it, Red Bull deny it. The FIA can't really find any evidence that they went over deliberately, but still, that's seemingly what Zak Brown and McLaren believe, and went on to say the following as well, that effectively they don't think that this action is sufficient to penalise and deter similar action in the future, and they don't believe that the crime fits the punishment in a sense, is what the implication is from Ferrari, and from McLaren, but also Ferrari. We'll see that here in a second, and that's the thing. Horner was like, they changed the rules or whatever, so it was unclear the interpretations and all this, and but the teams were made aware of this. No other teams had any issues, so I'm not really sure why Red Bull are complaining so much about it, but it is what it is at the end of the day. So McLaren say the crime doesn't fit the punishment, as in fact do Ferrari. Laurent Mekies here from Ferrari says the following: we at Ferrari do not understand how the 10% reduction can correspond to the same amount of lap time. The real effect of the penalty is very limited, as Red Bull can now use the money for wind tunnel on reducing the weight of the car or what else. That's an interesting point actually. So the 10% reduction is significant in testing time in the wind tunnel and in the computational fluid dynamics, the CFD simulation work that they can do on how good their car's going to be. But if they don't spend that time and money on the wind tunnel, then they can potentially spend that time elsewhere on, weight reductions, other things with the car. So he doesn't reckon that this 0.25 to half a second figure that Horner comes up with is actually anywhere like the reality. And yes, they might lose a bit on aero, but they can gain on, weight reductions or other things. So look, obviously Ferrari and McLaren have reason to say what they say, but they don't think the punishment is sufficient. Now, Toto Wolff gives a rather different perspective. He says that he doesn't really want to make a particular statement on whether it's too harsh, too lenient. He seems to think it's about right, actually. We'll see that in a second. But he also says reputational damage, and I think this is one of the key points as to why other teams probably won't go over in the future. This has a big impact on how people perceive Red Bull, and certainly for big brands like Mercedes, Ferrari, they just can't afford to be considered, cheats, right, in this sense. And he reckons that's one of the big implications here for Red Bull in terms of their reputation going forwards, not just the further implications.
What is the most important for me is that there is a robust governance. They didn't bulge an eyelid. They just followed the process, how it went. Federico and his team, Ksela and Nicolas, I think were absolutely good in assessing. I know how rigorous they were with us all throughout the year. That was a difficult process. I mean, when I'm seeing 13 positions that were wrong, with us it wasn't the case, and it's just overall good to see that there is a penalty, whatever, whether we deem it too low or too high. And it's a sport of marginal gains also. And whether it is 200,000 or 2 million, at the end everything costs performance. And we all had to cover sick pay and gardening leaves and the canteen. 9 teams were okay, 1 team was in breach.
So Red Bull have had the embarrassment, obviously, of this saga.
I think what you see that beyond a sporting penalty and a financial fine, it's also reputational damage. And in a world of transparency and good governance, that's just not on anymore. And compliance-wise, whatever team you are, you're responsible for representing a brand, your employees, your partners, and that's why for us it wouldn't be a business case.
He also went on to say this after the fact: I believe it is a lot of money, and what people from the outside don't understand, 10% wind tunnel restriction is a lot in Formula 1, and the damage to the reputation is what everyone will be afraid of, and this is why Horner's like full damage control at the moment. So, I mean, yeah, he reckons the 10% 10% wind tunnel restriction is quite a lot. Now, that takes them down from, I think, about 30-ish hours per week of testing time in the wind tunnel and CFD down to about 25 or so, whereas Ferrari and Mercedes have 32, 35 plus. So it's a pretty significant difference, and it's almost, I think Williams have 46 hours per week and Red Bull are going to have about 25. So Williams practically have twice the testing time, being the lowest placed constructor, than Red Bull do at the front. So in the long term, this really should be good for the sport, and it should be a punishment to Red Bull. Whether it's fair, whether it's not fair enough, I don't know. Red Bull are going to say it's draconian, as Horner says. Toto Wolff seems to think it's probably about right, and Ferrari and McLaren think it's way too lenient on them for various reasons. So who even knows, to be honest, and we'll see in due course. But my expectation is there's going to be a significant lag time here in terms of translating this kind of punishment in terms of what it actually means on track. And I doubt at the start of next season there's going to be a significant amount of difference in Red Bull's competitiveness. But if they're not that competitive at the start of next year, it's only likely to suffer as the season progresses. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.